English translation, 219th contact, Tuesday, 16th of June, 1987, 01:30 hours.
I'm glad to see you again. Anyhow, I longed for a conversation with you.
The joy is also mine. A warm welcome.
Thanks, my friend. If you do not mind, right at the beginning of our meeting, I would like to talk about something that moves me.
Nothing stands in the way of that. But later, can I still ask you some questions?
Naturally, then I will begin. It concerns the following, but now, the time has advanced more than what I estimated for our conversation. After all, we have talked for more than 2 hours. But it was a great joy for me, and I would also like to thank you for your explanations and your advice. You amaze me more and more.
The conversation was also a joy for me, and there is no reason for you to thank me. Rather, I should sooner thank you, for you gave me so much trust and initiated me into your private matters. But let us leave this, because if you have some more time, then I would be glad if I could still ask some questions.
I already gave you my assent.
If it is possible, I would still like to know a few things about the future, namely about the boom and the financial management of the companies and nations throughout the whole world. What is to be said about this?
The boom is almost over, and everything is approaching a great decline, with steadily rising unemployment in all industrialized nations of the world. This is due to a steadily increasing irresponsibility and mismanagement of the responsible persons who will fill their pockets with money and, through this, create enormous mountains of debt. The managers, boards of directors, and owners of firms will pay out millions of sums to themselves, which they will declare as remunerations or as settlements, and this already happens now and will happen more and more. Monstrous mountains of debt arise from these financial distributions, which will ultimately amount to hundreds of billions of Swiss francs or US dollars and, in the new millennium, even euros. But not only this form of economic crime will occur in the coming time, but also that which will exist as fraud and theft, as well as false accounting and large-scale accounting fraud. This also applies to the rest of the financial economy and the stock market operations, which will suffer tremendous precipitations and losses, especially after the turn of the millennium, which overall will basically be due to the incredible criminal and global mismanagement of an economic and financial form. Through the economic criminals, the nations and the firms will, in large numbers, be driven into ruin, to collapse, and into insolvency, and thus into bankruptcy, and there will not be any responsible ones who will confront all this criminal mismanagement, because everyone is either too trusting, naive, or too lowly intelligent to recognize and grasp the truth, or because they themselves are out for millions in order to redevelop themselves thereby in a criminal kind and wise. And since no responsible person will actually be able to be found, it will be such that a collapse of the financial economy and the industry takes place, which means that many economic enterprises and industrial enterprises will merge, lose their names, or change, and, in the end, be dissolved, for the financial resources seep away completely. Also, the financial stock exchange will experience very bad times in the coming years, but not until the third millennium will the worst stock exchange periods drive the shareholders nearly to despair, when the profits dwindle away in billions of dollars and Swiss francs, etc., and only bring the stock exchange papers weak values. And also in the upcoming European Union, there will be a lot of trouble when a new currency, called the euro, is introduced. Through the introduction of the euro, the prices for all goods and food will suddenly be raised considerably in all nations of the European Union, through which the human beings suddenly will not have enough money for their livelihood, etc. In particular, it will hit those people who have to live on a small pension and who, through the criminal and nationally unauthorized increase in food prices, etc., no longer have a livelihood. But the state leaders and others in charge will be blind to this, because they will not care about the misery of the poor, and they will have made their own dime through criminally inflated wages. Clandestine profiteering and other illicit things and machinations, as you once described the siphoning off of money.
Then the coming time will bring a lot of unpleasantness and evil in this regard. But how does it stand with the war crimes and the wars in general in the new millennium?
Everything relating to this will take its old course. But especially in the quickly coming time, as well as in the third millennium, America, Israel, Palestine, and Iraq will become a talking point in a sad and degrading way. In particular, the coming mightful figures of America, Israel, Palestine, as well as the dictator of Iraq, Bush, Sharon, Arafat, and Saddam Hussein will be in the first place, who will bring multiple murders over the human beings through henchmen and their military, and they will still be praised for this by irresponsible sympathizers from all over the world, as well as by the folk whom they govern. But we have already talked about this fairly often, so nothing more should have to be said about it, except that everything will degenerate extremely viciously, claim many human lives, and bring tremendous suffering over countless humans. No one will order a stop to the massacres. Quite the contrary. Many who are just as degenerate and who think criminally like the murderous rulers and their minions will still shout hooray for this, as you tend to say. The world will be full of blood, and to be sure, human blood, which is spilled criminally, heedlessly, irresponsibly, and senselessly by the responsible persons who order all the evil and disaster, all the murders, destruction, tortures, and annihilation. And it should also be considered that the ones implementing these criminal acts are in no iota better than the ones who give the orders to do so. And if the disaster is averted in one place, as will be the case in the GDR in a short time, and the wall of shame will also fall and be torn down, then in a short time a much worse, inhumane, and shameful evil of a similar kind will arise elsewhere. Even the despicable brickwork between East and West Germany will find a continuation through the coming Israeli ruler, Sharon, for in one of his bloody acts of terrorism that will demand innocent human blood, including many women and children who will fall victim to it, he will separate the Israeli territories from the Palestinian areas with a high and long fence. However, the criminal machinations of terror and war will not be limited to Sharon, his military, and his secret service, for also Arafat and his terrorist henchmen will bring a lot of murder, death, and suffering over many innocent women, children, and men, just as the upcoming American President Bush Jr. will also do so with his secret services, military, and special murderous henchmen. But even Saddam Hussein and the coming criminal and world terrorist, Bin Laden, of whom I have already reported to you, will become a talking point in a human-despising manner and bring innumerable deaths over innocent people. But I have already given explanations, made predictions, and cited prophecies about all these things several times.
You speak to me from the heart, my friend. If I had the power to stop everything and to create a better world, and to teach the human beings what is better and love, then I would do this with great joy and fervor. But I am insulted only as a spinner, lunatic, charlatan, and as a deceiver, and only very few truthfully reasonable human beings listen to my word and to the teaching that I provide. Almost no earth human wants to hear the truth, because this is extremely painful, and requires a lot of will, understanding, cognition, and energy to follow it.
Your words and feelings hit me, and I feel how hard it is working in you. Your words are good and right, but it will still take many centuries before the humans of the earth find their way to the truthly truth and to the true life in love, knowledge, and wisdom. You are doing the hardest and the first work for this, as well as all those humans who gather around you. But overall, you will have a very difficult position because the truthly truth does not want to be heard.
To further address what you said just now, on the earth, rulers, politicians, and other powerful figures, psychopaths, and paranoiacs, as well as their henchmen, may commit or order murders without hesitation and unhindered, carry out acts of terrorism, and cause wars in the name of justice, internal and external security, alleged peacekeeping or peacemaking, as well as alleged freedom and love. Here, it is asked, how immoral and degenerate in general such creatures must actually be, who order, carry out, or even just support such. It does not matter whether it is about torture, the death penalty or its enforcement, or about open-ended wars or murderous acts of secret services, sectarians, religious extremists, fundamentalists, or terrorists. Everything is reprehensible which amounts to quarrel, war, murder and mayhem, slavery, bondage, discord, unkindness, hatred, revenge and retaliation, as well as sectarianism, terrorism and destruction, and everything that brings harm to human beings, life, and evolution.
Unfortunately, there are no limits to the immorality and depravity of all those in the world who can exercise power in any kind and wise. This boundlessness is also true with respect to the greed for money. Wealth, resources, lands, countries, luxury, lust for power, revenge, retribution, self-perpetuation, pleasure, addiction, and vice, as well as all imaginable material unvalues, etc.
Unfortunately, that is actually so. There, you are right. May I address you once again on what you already told me a long time ago, but which was not written down as a contact conversation? With this, I refer to that which was perpetrated by the Japanese in China, during the occupation period of the Chinese people, in connection with bioweapon tests. As you mentioned, this fact is silenced, and consequently, very few of the Japanese people are aware of it, as this was also the case with the same or similar crimes under the Nazis, the Swedes, the French, and the Americans, as well as in various other nations in a military or private and scientific form, and is also kept secret up to this day and denied, which unfortunately can only be proven in most cases with extreme difficulty.
Yes, we have talked about that. Of course I can speak of it again.
Then the whole thing is not confidential.
That is of correctness. Everything happened during the Japanese occupation in China. In 1942, through the high leaders of the Japanese. And indeed, without the Japanese population being informed about it, southern China became contaminated with cholera, plague, and with other diseases during a long-term and large-scale secret action. Moreover, it concerned a large-scale and long-term series of tests involving bioweapons. In this consequence, plague-infected fleas were dropped from Japanese airplanes on various areas of southern China in large quantities, which were then mainly spread across the country by rats. Many people, and also other animals besides rats, were directly affected by it, through which the plague could spread rapidly, and eventually hundreds of thousands became sick and very many died. The people of the then affected area still suffer from this war crime today, which also will not change in the coming decades, because the plague cannot be fought easily and, therefore, cannot be eradicated quickly, which is why in southern China cases of plague appear over and over again, and this will also be the case in the future, Consider the immense numbers of rats that China is unable to control and that are still the carriers of the infected plague fleas transmitted by these rodents to domestic animals and humans, causing the disease to break out again and again, even if only sporadically. A fact that, since the end of World War II, has also been concealed by the Chinese government from the general public of China and from the whole world, and which will also continue to remain so for some time into the future. The authorship of the incredible war crime traces back to a renowned Japanese army doctor named Shiro Ishii, who, in 1940, with the consent of the Japanese heavenly Showa Tenno Hirohito, Emperor of Japan, brought into being the so-called Unit 731, and also led the murderous command in this. Through this unit, also tens of thousands of prisoners of war, Chinese, Koreans, and Russians, who were designated as blocks of wood, were used as experimental subjects by the researchers who bred and produced terrible strains of pathogens. The entire laboratory and research facility was officially and deceitfully handled as a wood processing plant, so that the terrible secret, which was really hidden behind it, would not become known among the population. This happened in a laboratory in the northern part of China, in Manchuria, in a place with the name of Pingfang. However, not only were the plague pathogens investigated, bred, and produced in immense masses, but also very dangerous pathogens of other diseases and epidemics, like, for example, anthrax, a pathogen by which splenic fever was released. Moreover, pathogens of typhoid fever and cholera were also produced, and so on. Then, the prisoners of war were infected with all kinds of bred pathogens, and once they became sick, living organ samples were cut out of their bodies, without anesthesia, in order to examine and investigate the effects of the inoculated disease strains in them, as well as to make further tests and to pursue research. Of course, all victims did not survive these tortures. Rather, they died in such pain that one can say that they did not just die painfully, but rather perished miserably and agonizingly. Furthermore, it is still to be explained that a Japanese army special unit in Pingfang bred and produced deadly pathogens of diseases and epidemics and spread these all over the areas of southern China by airplanes, as well as by railway and by all sorts of motorized road vehicles, causing hundreds of thousands of people to be inflicted by the diseases and epidemics, and very many died from it. Then, in Tokyo, at the end of World War II, when the war crimes trials took place, none of the Japanese researchers were called to account, through whose crimes 743,018 humans were murdered. A number that was criminally reduced in a truth-veiling manner by the responsible persons of the court to just around 250,000, in order to make everything seem somehow milder than it actually was. In fact, only several generals were indicted. For the researchers themselves, it was negotiated that they would remain unpunished if they handed over the research results and all formulas, etc. to the Americans, which then actually happened, of course, and with which the American researchers and scientists pursued research in the following years and decades and up to now, and they will pursue and continue to pursue these in the coming time. From the acquired results, vicious and deadly weapons usable for biological warfare naturally developed over time, which America also abundantly produced in large masses and has in stock. But it is specifically to be said to everything again that the whole thing is not at the expense of the Japanese people. For this people had no idea of all the terrible evil that the researchers and the Army Special Unit brought upon hundreds of thousands of human beings of the Chinese people. Thus, The Japanese people can never be held responsible for such monstrous crimes against humanity and war crimes. The real culprits were the researchers and the army doctor, Shiro Ishii, and primarily the Showa Tenno, Hirohito, the Emperor of Japan, who approved everything and, of course, also all those who supported the criminal matter and all those who spread the deadly pathogens over the country. And finally, it must still be said that at the end of the war, there were still more than 600 survivors of the prisoners of war, but they were cruelly murdered, so that they could not make any statements about the bestial, murderous, and deadly attempts of the butchers against the prisoners of war and against the people concerned in southern China.
That is what I wanted to hear again, so that I can write it down and present it to the public. The human beings of the earth should know by what bestial creatures their world is inhabited. This, however, not only refers to this story with Japan but also to America, Israel, Palestine, and Iraq, and otherwise to all nations whose criminal elements act in the wise you mentioned or in a similar manner and bring death, suffering, murder, destruction, and annihilation over the people and entire nations, and can still be praised high into the sky for it, and think that they are magnificent, humane, just, and infallible. These creatures must be denounced because of their criminal thoughts and actions, so that the humans can finally learn the truth and do not continue to shout hooray for these thugs and murderers.
You will keep your word, because I know how serious this is to you.
You are right about that. But now, again something else. In the old history of Hainok and the travelers from afar, from the depths of space, and with these, the refugees of Henok's lineage from the Sirius region, there is talk of the fact that these chose a system with an already dying sun in order to escape from the captors. This was so because the pursuers did not expect it and, even today, do not expect that the refugees chose for themselves a dying or passing sun, which will only exist for a few billion years and which only had 3 habitable planets in its system, one of which could only be transitionally inhabited for a short time, namely Mars, while another, thus Melona or Phaeton, was destroyed by its inhabitants, which resulted in the asteroid belt. Moreover, there was still the fact that the Sirius regions, from where the refugees broke out, were in a different space-time configuration, and the refugees settled in another space-time plane, simply in our space and our time, which was a foreign area to the Sirians and which could not be found by them up to this day, for on the one hand, there are simply too many of the most diverse space-time configurations in the entire universe, and on the other hand, the Sirians did not have the Hainok technology of the space-time exchange. But now, 2 specific questions about this. First of all, do the distant descendants of the Sirians from their other space-time configuration, or from their other space-time plane, still presently search for the refugees of Hainok's lineage, whose most distant descendants are some of today's Earth humans? And secondly, are the distant descendants of these Sirians in a position today to penetrate into other space-time configurations? And actually, this still gives rise to a third question that is related to this. Why actually was a solar system searched for, which only had a few inhabitable planets?
The danger of the pursuit of the refugees, or rather their distant descendants, by the distant descendants of the former inhabitants of Sirius is no longer existent, because over many thousands of years, the disposition of the Sirians has changed for the better, and so now they live in peace and without ambitions for power. Today, their aspirations are more focused on consciousness-related and spiritual progress than just on power, revenge, and retaliation, in consequence of which, also, everything that had happened at the earliest times, with the genetically manipulated ones and their work and escape, was ordered into oblivion by a council's decision. But still, they also developed their technology further in every form. Consequently, they also became capable of changing from their space-time plane into another. But unfortunately, this was to the advantage of a small group of diehards who had taken over the old hatred and thoughts of revenge as well as the retaliatory desires of the old Syrians from generation to generation, and also further maintained them. But today, these are now just 63 of their human beings who continue in the traditional hatred and try to cause harm to the most distant descendant of the Sirius refugees, even in the wise that they try to transport you from life and thereby make your mission and the spiritual teaching, aka creation energy teaching, impossible. Unfortunately, they also arrived into the possession of the technology that enables them to change into the most diverse space-time planes. So even into this one, in which the SOL system exists, which they have indeed found after centuries of searching. They try to cause harm to you, as well as to all those around you, and to the teaching and the mission and elsewhere, namely, by intimidating and threatening the Earth humans who have observed our beam ships, or the ones of other extraterrestrial visitors to the Earth, or who have found any proof of their existence. Through these hateful elements that cooperated with the Giza intelligences, human beings of the Earth were also injured or kidnapped, etc., but this only occurred rarely. Moreover, these renegades and black men, as we also call them, and these have nothing to do with the so-called men in black, who are of earthly origin and, thus, who are secret service-driven Earth humans, who strive to induce real visions and hallucinations through apparatus-driven, suggestive impulses in Earth humans who are susceptible to these. Their repertoire ranges from fake sightings and observations as well as alleged abductions up to simulated contacts and sexual intercourse with extraterrestrials, from which alleged pregnancies occur that, if they already appear, are caused quite normally with an earthly partner or by artificial manipulation of a medical nature or one's own nature. Also through these extraterrestrial black men, the illusion is produced in susceptible Earth humans that somehow, through carelessness, etc., things penetrated into their body unnoticed, such as the incidence of metal fragments or small projectiles, implants of extraterrestrial forces and beings, which is absurd, of course. Since these Sirius renegades are too small in their numbers to inflict really major damage on Earth and its inhabitants, they have invested in their hatred in order to create confusion in manifold forms all over the Earth among the humans. Moreover, as I already said, they try to destroy the spiritual teaching, aka creation energy teaching, and your mission, and indeed, even by instigating unstable Earth humans to kill you or to make it impossible for you through lies, deceit, and slander, and to represent you as a liar, swindler, forger, and fraud, which you will still experience, unfortunately, even in your own family, as I have seen through a look into the future. Unfortunately, we are not able to catch these extraterrestrial black men elements because they always vanish into a space-time plane whose coordinates we cannot detect and cannot register. For quite obviously, these Sirius renegades have a coordinate distorter or otherwise have a possibility to distort the coordinate data, whereby we cannot capture them and cannot get a hold of the offenders. In addition, the elements are extremely vigilant and clever, so it could take years or decades before we get them on track and dissuade them from their actions. We have to wait until they make a mistake, or until our scientists find a possibility to decipher their coordinates upon the disappearance of the renegades into another space-time plane.
Then we can still exercise some patience. So let us talk about something else. Although we have already talked about this several times, I would like a specific answer from you. As Ptah said and showed to me, There is a lot of water on and also under the surface Mars in the form of ice, mostly very close to the surface of Mars, whereby the South Pole is of special importance in this regard. As Ptah explained, however, not all ice consists of water, but also of other materials. Now, the question about this is whether you have foresight as to whether this water can one day be used by the Earth humans, once they eventually colonize Mars and can, so to speak, bring it back to life. And in the coming time, will the fact of the presence of the enormous canyons and black sand dunes and water on Mars be discovered by probes, if such should be sent to the Red Planet and reach this at all?
That will be the case several times in the coming time in reference to the water, namely, that large occurrences of water in the form of ice and snow can be proven by probes on Mars. But the final certainty will first be attained at the beginning of the third millennium, and to be sure, by a Mars probe that will be called 2001 Mars Odyssey, as our look into the future has revealed.
And will it also become clear through this, then, that Mars once supported life, and that, in fact, exotic life exists on the planet? I mean microbes and the like.
No, that will not yet be the case at that time. The time for that will not be until much later.
And how does it stand with the storms on Mars? Will these also be investigated then? And will it also be discovered that there is something like flashes of lightning up there? And since we are already at it, through the powerful flashes of lightning on the good old Earth, which shoot vertically into the air at around 100 kilometers per second, radio waves arise with such high frequencies that through these, the very sparsely settled air molecules are brought to radiating illumination. Is this a specific feature that only appears on Earth, or does this phenomenon also occur on other planets?
This likewise applies to other worlds, both those that are of the same nature as the Earth and those that are of a different nature.
You mean in terms of the various planetary spheres, if I understand you correctly? By that, I mean the atmosphere or troposphere, stratosphere, stratopause, mesosphere, mesopause, thermosphere, exosphere or dissipation sphere, the neutrosphere, homosphere, heterosphere, and ionosphere, as well as the geosphere and biosphere, the lithosphere, respectively the Earth's mantle layer and the Earth's crust, and the inner asthenosphere, etc.
You astonish me.
It is only half as bad. It is all just school knowledge and book knowledge. But tell me, you recently said that around the turn of the millennium, a new space station would be built, which should orbit the Earth at a high altitude. ISS, or International Space Station, you have called it. How high should this float above the Earth or all around the Earth? And how high and low will the temperature be up there?
The very large station will orbit the Earth at about 400 kilometers of altitude. And at this altitude, there prevails a positive temperature of about 120 degrees and a negative temperature of about 150 degrees, if I am not mistaken.
Aha, so there can also be mistakes with you. But tell me, when I took the deep sea tour with you, there I saw life forms in the deepest depths, which will certainly still remain invisible and unexplainable to our deep-sea researchers and scientists for a long time, as this will also be the case for many of the giant animals that live in higher and middle sea depths, as for example the giant snakefish which look like giant eels, which are up to 15 meters long, as you said, then likewise the giant sharks that are up to 14 meters long and which have such large mouths that one might think that a third of the fish come from these. But then, there were still the giant beasts, which you called deep-sea eels, and which had a kind of tentacle mane, and which, once they are fully grown, and as you also explained, can be up to 18 to 22 meters long. I was also impressed by the giant jellyfish, whose catching arms or tentacles were about 45 meters long, according to your explanation. Also those monstrous predatory sharks were to be regarded as enormous, which you described as rapacious and predatory creatures. And when I think that these fish, according to your data, were 10, 12, and 14 meters long. Then one could learn fear if one would face these beasts under other and unprotected circumstances, than just in such a manner as we were protected in your ship. But that there are deep-sea squid, which have long, delicate, and fine tentacles, several of which you also let me see and observe. Of this I also knew nothing, as well as not of the existence of all the other deep-sea creatures, or deep-sea life forms. And here, I wrote down the name that you told me in reference to that beast that made a strange impression on me, and concerning which you explained that it concerns a distant descendant form of the Carcharodon megalodon, as you dictated its name to me. Even more could be said of what was experienced and seen, but I want to concern you with a question, namely, how many deep-sea creatures of every kind and size can one still reckon, which have remained undiscovered up to now, if one can attach a number to this at all?
That is also unknown to us, but we estimate that in the deep sea of the earthly oceans, about 12 million undiscovered genera and species of organisms still exist, and the number of individual species, according to their size, is probably in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or in the millions with the biggest and largest creatures, and in the tens of millions, billions, trillions, quadrillions, up to innumerableness with the smallest and tiniest life forms.
With the innumerable life forms, it probably concerns microorganisms and so on, right? And how large or tiny are they, for example, in relation to a fine tip of a hair?
Yes, I speak of microorganisms. However, these stand in no comparison in their size to a hair's tip, because they are so tiny that billions of specimens could be found on such.
Then these are probably thermal microorganisms, that is to say thermal bacteria, or even thermophilic microorganisms, as you and Ptah once called these super small creatures, if I remember correctly. Unfortunately, I must inquire into this, for since my breakdown in 1982, I no longer have the memory capacity as before. You know that I am still working up what was lost and no longer reliably recall everything that I knew before.
You remember very well. You said everything that is to be said. A further explanation from me is not necessary.
Also good. Then another question about the large and giant deep-sea life forms, such as the giant sharks, giant squid, giant eels, and giant snakefish, etc. For centuries, stories from sailors wander through the world like ghosts, which describe sea monsters and deep-sea monsters that are said to have attacked ships on the seas, and that have even sunk these, and that also should have killed sailors. Is this actually somewhat true, or is it all just storytelling?
The stories have their validity, even if many things seem implausible due to a lot of exaggeration. Of course, there are also many invented stories that have no truth content at all. So not everything that has been and that will be told can be accepted as given, as this is also the case with respect to many other things.
So I imagined, yes. But it is also clear to me that various stories are just so-called sailors' yarns, as this also applies to the alleged ship's kobold, as well as to the unbelievable stories regarding St. Elmo's fire, which there actually is, however, through the atmospheric electricity. But now a question that demands your doctor's knowledge. Dyslexia, which is also designated as a writing disorder or orthography disorder, if I am correctly oriented, is this inheritable?
That is of correctness. Dyslexia is inheritable through genetic misinformation or genetic deformation, that is to say, genetic damage.
I was asked about the apartheid system in South Africa and about the civil rights activist, Nelson Mandela, who has been imprisoned there for many years because he made himself unpopular in the political struggle against the oppression and was condemned as a public enemy to lifelong imprisonment. How long will the oppressive apartheid system continue to exist if it is abolished at all? And Nelson Mandela, will he ever be free again? Have you had a look into the future in relation to this?
Nelson Mandela will be released into freedom again after 27 years of imprisonment, through the intervention of an authoritative Swiss diplomacy on the 11th of February 1990. At a later time, and to be sure, in the month of April 1994, the system of racial segregation that has existed since 1948 will be cancelled and placed permanently out of power. In the same year, Nelson Mandela will be proclaimed as the President of the Republic of South Africa, but he will only hold the office of President until 1999 and will resign at his own desire.
Then there are, therefore, only a few years of the terror of the whites against the various non-whites in South Africa. That is good to hear. Such progress is praiseworthy. But now, 2 questions about the colors of the universe. You surely remember Professor Janowski, the astrophysicist. We have already discussed a question of his once. He asked, what original color did the material universe, that is to say the material creation belt, exhibit? What color followed thereafter? What is given today? And what colors will be given in the future? And what will be given with the contraction of the universe? He also asks how these colors can be calculated, and whether this is possible at all, or whether the earthly scientists of astrophysics are presently in a position to do this, or will be in the future.
I want to answer the first question first. The color of the universe can only be calculated in accordance with all sources of light of all galaxies in the form of a combination of the same. And to be sure, while a so-called cosmos spectrum or universe spectrum is created from this. This is an average value which is not visible to the human eye and which results from combinations of young, blue and old red stars of the galaxies, as well as from nebulous formations and gas clouds of a cosmic form. From this, it also follows that the color of the universe does not always remain the same, but varies, because depending on the overall mass and luminosity of all sources of light, the color changes. During the formation of the universe, the greatest brightness was given, a beaming bright white Zohar light that resulted from the Big Bang explosion. Then came the blue phase of the galaxy's development and stars' development, etc., from which the material form of the present universe developed, which exhibits a beige color that, over the course of time and evolutionary change, will be followed by the colors of turquoise, green, red, and yellow. So since the origin of the universe, there is the following series of colors up to its end. 1 beaming, bright, white Zohar light Big Bang phase 2, beaming blue existence development phase 3, beige first existence phase 4, turquoise second existence phase 5, green third existence phase 6, red final existence phase 7, yellow contraction phase.
Thanks. This information will please him. But now, again something else. As one knows, the mountains on Earth are still growing, but at the same time, erosion also takes place. An amateur geologist asked me as to what mountain on Earth has the greatest and fastest growth, and at the same time, the greatest erosion. And since you also occupy yourself with geology, and indeed even in an earthly relation as you said, you should actually be able to answer this question, right?
That is of correctness. To answer the question is not a problem. This is the Nanga Parbat mountain in Pakistan, which belongs to the Himalayan mountains and to the 8000ers.
Then that would also be clear. So thus the next question, namely about Atlantis. If I remember correctly, Simyase once said that there had not been only 2 Atlantises, the Great Atlantis and the Small Atlantis. Do you know about this?
Yes. There were 4 different Atlantises, so the new Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, between the Azores and Spain. Then there was the small Atlantis that existed in the Mediterranean Sea in the area of Santorini. And then Old Atlantis is to be mentioned, on which later, after its downfall, Troy was built, while Great Atlantis had its existence in the Atlantic. The Atlanteans of Great Atlantis were the rulers over all 4 Atlantises and their peoples, for they all belong to the same origin. Thus, a central government was given, but the administration of the various Atlantises took place through authorized representatives, who were called the Lieutenant.
Then soon I will have asked all questions. So still this. Months ago, a young man was with me who had severe psychological problems that arose from sexual conduct during his childhood, and, to be sure, by a pedophile Catholic priest. The man hesitated for a long time about the story before he told it to me. And quite obviously, he was very seriously burdened by his experiences with the priest. But out of shame and anxiety, he could not talk to anyone for over 17 years about what had naturally burdened his psyche, through which became more and more closed and isolated. Thus, I had the greatest difficulty in assuring him that he could trust me and that I could surely give him some good advice. But the whole thing lasted for 4 hours before he was finally ready for speak.
Excuse me for interrupting you, but would one not correctly say to speak instead of for speak?
Of course. Then have I said 4 instead of 2?
That you have.
Then I have misspoken. Please check the mistake for me. Now it turned out, then, that the priest mentioned by him is known to me. Moreover, it concerns a man who is already older now, to whom I will read the riot act with the opportunity. But what I really want to say is that the young man, after he had expressed himself to me and had told me the whole story, feels changed and liberated since then, and indeed continuously, as he even told me last night on the telephone. Quite obviously, he could free himself from his age-old burden through the conversation with me, and now leads a reasonable and carefree life, liberated from the old burden. The question now is whether you can take me to this priest, so that I can take him to task. You know that, because of my health, I cannot go by train, and I do not want someone to take me there by car. For one would have to ask me for the reason behind the visit with the priest, and I would have to give an untruthful answer, which does not lie within me, however. Moreover, one would then also know where the priest exercises his office.
I can meet your wish. We will still talk about that. Of course, it is good if you are silent over the name of the priest, as well as over the place where he holds his office. But one thing you should be aware of regarding the pedophilic sexual abuse of the priest is that this is not an isolated case. For among the Catholic priests, pedophilia is widely spread, which is due not in the least to celibacy. In the primary form, homosexual machinations appear in this regard. And in fact, there are thousands of Catholic priests throughout the world who violate children and adolescents in a pedophilic manner. An evil that will run more and more rampant in the coming time. And indeed, not just with Catholic priests, but also with the teachers of schools and sports, as well as in child pornography and child prostitution, and even with many parents who sexually abuse their children. In the coming time, it will all take on ever greater and worse proportions, which, on the one hand, is due to the fact that through Beta USA, the sexual taboo became destroyed, which led to the fact that worldwide, open prostitution and pornography can be publicly operated in many forms, without punitive measures being taken against it, which will lead in the coming time to crass Ausartung, to get very badly out of control of the good human nature. And on the other hand, this also traces back to the machinations of Beate Uhse, whereby all morals in reference to sexuality become violated, which will still worsen in the coming years and decades. by what means practically the entire world will become a cesspool of sexual degeneracy. And this will be tolerated by the authorities of the governments, because many of them will be involved in these machinations themselves in a profit-winning or vice-fulfilling wise. Of course, there will only be a few who will be called to account, while the majority of all fallible ones can pursue and indulge in their criminal, immoral, and Oski Arditan, having gotten very badly out of control of the good human nature, sexual machinations undisturbed. And also included in the majority of the offending perpetrators are all those who somehow advocate, contribute to, or who are even the beneficiaries of the machinations, therefore, also included. Therein are all those who involve themselves in these machinations, directly or indirectly.
Well said, and it especially has the last word in itself in order to describe the matter. Then I now have just 3 questions. The climate change that is going on, and that should progress more and more rapidly in the coming years. As you mentioned at another time, this is very well due, in part, to the senselessness of human beings, with their environmental pollution, air pollution, land degradation, water degradation, and in general the overall environmental degradation in every respect. Of course, we have already talked about this often, but I am still asked the same questions over and over again. All the coming events in the upcoming years and decades, which are teeming with natural disasters of all kinds, and which will demand many human lives and cause enormous devastation, also trace back, however, to quite natural causes, as these have already been given by nature and cosmic influences for millions of years. Am I right in my acceptance that already for quite some time, and in the near and more distant future, everything related to this can approximately be divided by 2? That even about 50% is of natural origin, and about 50% is of unreasonable, destructive human origin.
That is of correctness. The ratio is to be regarded approximately in this measure.
You said something about the ice of the poles, namely what % of the ice at the poles will have melted by the year 2000, etc.
That is of correctness. I remember that. The explanation was that by the year 2000, through the climate change, that is to say global warming, about 40% of the pole's ice layers will have melted away in their density, whereby, however, also another effect will appear, namely that enormous blocks of ice will break off and float through the seas as enormous icebergs several square kilometers in size.
Right, that was it exactly. Then the last question for today. Atopic dermatitis, eczema. By what means does this vile evil appear, which drives the poor people who are befallen to it half into insanity?
This is an allergy with a very broad excitation spectrum, which can be caused genetically or by other internal or external influences. Specifically, the following points are to be mentioned for external influences, but I can only cite some of them because the spectrum is very broad. 1. Chemical agents and substances of all kinds. 2. Natural resources and substances of all kinds. 3. Food before beverages. 5. Gases. 6. Pollen of trees, flowers, bushes, grass, and grains of every kind. 7. Cleaning agents of every kind. 8. Hygiene products of every kind. 9. Insects of all kinds. 10. Fruits and vegetables of all kinds. 11. Animal products of all kinds. 12. Contacts with animals or things of all kinds. These are the main factors that, depending on the case, can trigger atopic dermatitis if a person, as a result of an unstable immune system, reacts sensitively and susceptibly to one or more of their causative agents.
Then those were all the questions that I had today.
Then I will say goodbye.
Not so fast, my friend. You said that we will still discuss the matter regarding the visit with the priest.
That is of correctness. Then we will now agree upon a time